Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life is produced by the Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, a division of the University of North Dakota's College of Arts and Sciences. Visit us online at whyradioshow.org.
Hi, I'm Jack Russell Weinstein, host of Why, Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. Today we are asking how to do philosophy in politically difficult times with guests Elizabeth Anderson and Jason D. Hill. Last week, for the first time, a scheduled guest canceled for political reasons. America's reactionary climate is too risky for them, they told me, and being on public radio might make them a target. I get it. During the first 17 years of Why Radio, neither political nor professional repercussions ever entered my mind. For the last 10 months, though, their possibility has been a constant background hum. I understand why the guest withdrew, and I fully support the decision. They have a standing invitation to be my guest whenever they feel up to it. As for me, I had a little over a week to pull a show out of nowhere, and I couldn't get past the nagging feeling that the guest's cancellation had to be faced head-on. Our listeners have the right to know what current political life is doing to the show. And if the community we have built means anything, all of you should be part of the resulting conversation. So I reached out to two previous guests who immediately agreed to participate. They even bent over backwards to make my already scheduled recording slot. Their being here is a real kindness. It is, if you know the Hebrew word, a mitzvah. We haven't coordinated in advance, nor do I have much of a plan for what will fold. What I wanted was two sophisticated senior scholars with good grasps of philosophy as a whole, with enough experience to explore our political moment in thoughtful and compelling ways. I told my guests that I wanted us to be spontaneous, to show off our uncertainty, and to ruminate in front of all of you. All we ever see on the news are people who present perfect, scripted, soundbite-worthy responses to breaking news, as if things are simple. As if those of us without prepackaged solutions to the complexities of the world are somehow lesser beings than pundits who sell their personal brand while demanding our silent agreement in return. The most popular alternative to the corporation-funded TV prognosticator is the internet tough guy. Prophetic bloggers, tweeters, and commenters who are as certain of their opinion as the political analysts, while bullying people who publicly assert opinions other than theirs. These takedowns are laced with hate, violence, and delusions of authoritarian legitimacy. One of the famous rules of the internet is Poe's law. It states that there is a point at which online behavior is so extreme that it becomes impossible to tell the difference between parody and a sincere expression of beliefs. I'd like to add to this. My first variation is that given enough emotional commitment, it becomes impossible to distinguish between advocacy and trolling. My second is that when faced with true emotional exhaustion, apathy and resignation are impossible to tell apart. What I mean is that we live in a period during which online voices speak with the same desperate passion about starving war victims as they do about whether Star Wars: The Last Jedi has tainted the fictional character Luke Skywalker. We are also immersed in a political reality under which most of us feel the same lethargy about washing dishes as we do about the 6 mass shootings that took place just this past weekend. Our passions and outrage are misplaced. They target indiscriminately. Our acceptance of awfulness has drained us, and the only place most of us experience individual agency is behind the false protection of a keyboard. The discipline of philosophy resists these disempowering social forces, while inviting people to a collective that both respects and expands the laws of logic and reveals and nudges human reason and rationality. It seeks truth in the face of a reality distorted by appearance while embracing the abstract forces interwoven throughout metaphysics. Philosophy recognizes that humanity assigns meaning to everything from appeals to God to antidepressants. Lord knows philosophy has had its bigots, its closed-minded and profoundly evil spokespeople. But in itself, it aims to construct a society of interlocutors who unify the questions people have passed and posed since the first time someone had the good fortune to ask, how might the world be different than I think it is now? Because of this, many people have called philosophy dangerous. Philosophers have been ridiculed, threatened, imprisoned, exiled, killed, and silenced. Our task today is not to tell these particular stories, but to acknowledge that these threats are once again being leveled, and not just against philosophy, but against the arts, humanities, and the social and hard sciences. The attack against the legitimacy of expertise has morphed into the effort to undermine inquiry itself. How do we deal with this? What do we do? That's what we're here to talk about. I often joke that no one has less power than a 56-year-old philosophy professor at the University of North Dakota. I can barely get my students to do their homework, let alone stop plagiarizing the convenient inaccuracies of ChatGPT. I'm therefore incapable of turning a Republican into a Democrat, a heterosexual into a homosexual, or a man into a woman. I just want my students' attention for a little while and to inspire occasional post-class reflection on the ideas they encounter in my class. I simply cannot figure out why this feels so burdensome to those who demonize universities, but it does. They aren't as scared of me as I am of them, but for some reason, they are terrified of what I do and are making enormous efforts to undermine, defund, and eventually eradicate it. Many professors are lying low, hoping they will not be noticed. I have a nagging voice in my mind telling me that I should be doing this too, but I just can't. I've been given the honor of caretaking this show and the Institute for Philosophy and Public Life for too long to let this moment pass. So let's discuss the elephant in the room, the repressive social and political forces telling educators to shut up and go away. Maybe doing this is a mistake and I'll end up regretting the consequences. I hope not. I love doing philosophy with all of you. And now our guests. Elizabeth Anderson is John Dewey Distinguished University Professor of Philosophy and Women's and Gender Studies, Professor of Law, and Arthur F. Thurnau, Professor at the University of Michigan. She's the author of 4 books, most recently Hijacked, How Neoliberalism Turned the Work Ethic Against Workers and How Workers Can Take It Back, from Cambridge University Press. Jason D. Hill is Professor of Philosophy and Honors Distinguished Faculty at DePaul University. He's the author of 6 books, most recently Letters to God from a Former Atheist, from Vindicta Books. Liz, Jason, welcome back to Why.
Thank you, Jack.
Good to be here.
If you'd like to participate, please share your favorite moments from the show and tag us on social networks. Our handle is always at Why Radio Show, WHY Radio Show. Rate us on iTunes, Spotify, or your preferred podcast platform so that others can find the show, and listen to all 17 seasons worth of episodes for free, as well as our sister show, Philosophical Currents, at our website, whyradioshow.org. And as always, this show can only happen with your support. We exist solely on listener contributions, so click donate in the upper right-hand corner of our website to make your tax-deductible donation through the University of North Dakota Alumni Foundation portal. So, Liz, Jason, I guess I want to start off with a basic question. And Liz, I'll start with you. Does it feel different being a college professor right now?
I don't feel that much of a difference personally in my own conduct in the classroom and in various discussions on campus, but the campus feels under grave threat. Oddly, given the way politics is polarized fundamentally about issues such as race and gender, the people who are most under stress these days are the scientists, especially in the biomedical fields, whose grants have been cut. That kind of politicization has cast a pall over the whole campus, and I think a great deal of uncertainty, too, about what the future might hold.
This is, I think, a really important distinction for our listeners who may not be that immersed in the university culture. Philosophy is a fairly inexpensive discipline, and so we can get away with buying books, buying a computer, worst case scenario, writing on a pad of paper with a pencil. But the scientists are burdened with needing lots and lots of money, and that gives people control over them that philosophers may not be subject to. Jason, how about you? What does it feel different being a professor right now?
Very different. I've been a professor for 28 years now, 25 at DePaul. And, so I've taught, I just turned 60. And when I first started teaching, so I've taught my generation, I think that's Gen Y, and I've taught the millennials and now Gen Z. When I first started teaching, I was told, or it felt like it was a branch of showbiz. And with the millennials, it was a little bit different. And now I feel very much like a therapist in the classroom because of the increased advance of mental illness among the Gen Z generation, which I take very differently. And of course, there's also the fear factor among my students who feel an enormous pressure not to utter the wrong perceived political views for fear of reprisals, which would include fear of, especially among my foreign students, fear of having their scholarships revoked, fear of being reported. And so there's an enormous pressure on me as a professor in the classroom to make sure that each person feels not just safe, but in my mind, I'm more conscious of reminding myself that each person remains a unit of moral concern, that no one is expelled from the domain of the ethical, from the pantheon of the human community. And that sort of hyper consciousness that I bring to my teaching every day was not there 28 years ago. I don't think it was as consciously conjured up in my mind that I have to remember that there are people in my classroom who others would like to have evicted from the domain of the ethical, from the pantheon of the human community. And so that hyper consciousness that's operating on multiple levels makes me feel very much like a custodian, more of a custodian, a vanguard, a sentinel of the humanity of my students in a way that I hadn't consciously really felt before.
That's super interesting because one of the things we don't talk that much about is the duty of care that professors have even for students who are technically adults. There was a time when professors were gatekeepers, when professors pushed students away and said, we are weeding out the failing students and we are rewarding the successful ones, and we don't care about their emotions. But this has changed for many reasons, commitments to inclusivity, changes to what kind of texts we teach. To what extent does the political context necessitate what you're talking about, Jason? And I guess I'll ask Liz, do you feel an increase in the duty of care that maybe got less of your attention a while ago?
I have noticed increasing anxiety on the part of the students. And I'm not a therapist, but I do direct students to counseling services. At the same time, sometimes when their anxiety is specifically focused on their academic performance, then I do feel like there are things I can do to address that worry. So I had a student actually at the end of the last semester. She had had some mental health problems that led her to miss some short assignments. And she wrote to ask for an extension so that she could complete the assignments after the end of the semester, get it incomplete. And what I sensed in her was she was just desperate to get an A. Like if she didn't get an A in the course, this would be deeply damaging to her own self-image. And she was really in deep distress about that. And I thought, look, this is something I can address as an academic. A's are not important. A's do not define who you are or your worth. They are only the grade you get at the end of the term is just a cut in a stream of constant learning. And I sensed in her a desire to really learn. And I wanted to help her separate her sense of grades from whether she's learning, because learning is a continuous process. And the grade really, it isn't even a good measure of that because it is just momentary. And so we actually embarked on a pretty extended dialogue in which I tried to guide her to a more healthy self-conception of herself as a thinker, as someone who's intellectually engaged and serious as she was. I think she came to a better place. So in that respect, I can extend care to people, to my students in anxious times in that way. But in other respects, I really have to leave it to the therapists.
One of the things that I've found myself doing is anticipating emotional responses to the actual philosophical content. So I teach philosophy of law, and this semester, on Tuesday, I was teaching critical race theory, which it comes out of 1960s legal theory, and you have to talk about it before they go on to law school. And I introduced the topic by saying, we're going to talk about this. It's gotten a lot of attention. So let me say off the bat, it's a very homogeneous class. North Dakota is predominantly white. UND is predominantly white. I said, none of you are responsible for slavery. You weren't born. And I give you, I think these were my exact words, I give you permission not to feel guilty for being white. That's what we are talking, that's what we're talking about. But no one expects you to feel guilty. And if someone portrays critical race theory that way, they're misinterpreting that. So even before I engaged in the content, I prepared them emotionally for the knee-jerk political reaction. Jason, I know you had an initial response to the question, so please respond to that too. But does that experience feel familiar to you at all, that you're preparing them for content as well as the stressful university environment?
Absolutely. I mean, I've had to pivot and adjust my pedagogical style to not just the changing times, but to the students' self-perception of themselves in the classroom, who they take themselves to be as students, and who they take themselves to be in relation to the material. So that pivoting has really adjusted my teaching style. And I wouldn't say that I sort of emotionally buffer them for the material. What I do is I sort of just assure each of them that regardless of their politics, unless they Google me, they don't know my political stance. And I never import politics into my classroom. I'm totally against it. I don't proselytize. I'm very sort of an orthodox, old-fashioned scholar of text. But what I do is I sort of just assure them that whatever their personal views are, they could be anarchists, they could be socialists, or communists, or Republicans, or libertarians, that there's a protocol of respect and civility that will suffuse my classroom. And whatever discomfort that they might have, that this is the place to respectfully, and do not trespass on the dignity, do not eviscerate other people of their dignity, that the classroom could be a place to mull through that discomfort. And as a community, we work through that discomfort together. But the discomfort is not a sign for discrediting a legitimate argument, and the discomfort is not an excuse for silence. So in one sense, I'm on the same page as you. I probably just don't go into the kind of anticipating conflict or discomfort. I've become a lot more personable, Jack and Liz. And by that, I mean, I'm more interested in gauging the student's relationship to the text. And each student has a one-on-one Socratic moment with me. So I'll go up to the student and I'll say, I'll pick a particular passage and I'll have them sort of exegetically repeat what the thinker is saying, and have them read that passage and quiz them on it, and have them conceptually develop their relationship to that passage. And each student knows that their turn is going to come. And so they sort of really treasure that. And that has deviated from the standard 20-minute very formal lecture that I used to deliver. Now I sort of give a 10-minute lecture, and then we have discussion, then I give another 5-minute lecture. And that's one way of sort of emotionally anchoring them in the material in a piecemeal way. But to answer your question, yes, I have pivoted. My pedagogical style has really, really shifted. I mean, I was born and raised in Jamaica and went to British school, and I sort of imported that old-fashioned way of teaching when I first became a professor, and it worked. It worked magnificently 28 years ago. And I was completely indifferent to how students might react, because John Stuart Mill worked with the East India Company. Now I have students saying, Professor Hill, he's a racist, and we're not going to read John Stuart Mill. Or John Locke wrote the Constitution for the Carolinas. Why should we read the second treatise on government? And so I have to sort of give a long preamble and explain, well, yes, this is problematic, but here's why you should read the text, that sort of thing.
It's interesting, pressure comes from all sides. It comes from the left, it comes from the right, it comes from the middle, however we frame it. Liz, building off of what Jason just said, you teach at a very large school, and you teach everything from undergraduates in what I presume are very large lecture courses to advanced grad students who you are dealing with one-on-one and looking at their dissertations and things like that. How do you attend to the individuality of the students in those two contexts, and how aware are you of their reactions as individuals to the content and the philosophical challenges that you're putting at their feet?
Well, there's a couple of things. I recently changed my mode of assignment. I've replaced one of the paper assignments with the requirement that they take notes on the reading and then submit very, very brief reflections on what they've been reading. Partly it's a response to the rise of AI and the ease of generating papers just with a simple query. But part of it is because I think it's very important for students to develop a sense of their own voice. One of the things that AI does not do for them is help them with that. AI tends to make everything sound generic and flat. And so struggling with the text and showing their struggles and, the reflections could be critical, but they could also be like, I don't understand what this passage means. And, let me try out a couple of interpretations. But you can see how they're working through the text. And that's a way actually for them to develop their own distinctive voice and perspective when they're writing and just working through some difficult texts.
Is that a different experience for undergraduates and graduate students? I mean, obviously their voices in there and their level of sophistication is going to be different, but
This is for undergrads in my large
yes.
lecture classes. The grad students are already, right? They already know how to do this.
We are going to take a break. When we get back, I want to pull the AI thread a little bit. But before we do that, I will ask, and I'll tell Liz and Jason and our listeners this in advance, I will ask one of the key questions that are on the table, which is, do professors indoctrinate our students? But before then, we'll take a break. You're listening to Elizabeth Anderson, Jason D. Hill, and myself, Jack Russell Weinstein, on Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. We'll be back right after this.
The Institute for Philosophy and Public Life bridges the gap between academic philosophy and the general public. Its mission is to cultivate discussion between philosophy professionals and others who have an interest in the subject, regardless of experience or credentials. Visit us on the web at philosophyandpubliclife.org. The Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, because there is no ivory tower.
We are back with Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. I'm your host, Jack Russell Weinstein. I'm talking with Elizabeth Anderson and Jason D. Hill, asking how we do philosophy in politically difficult times. And one of my favorite experiences is what I call the 5-year email. You get it particularly when you work with undergraduates, where you just get an email out of the blue where a student says, you may not remember me, I don't know, I took your class, blah, blah, but this happened and it made me think of your class. Or the idea that you gave me was super influential. I once got an email from someone who many years later talked about how my class informed how they were a soccer coach for their kids' school. And that's always very powerful. And it led a friend of mine, Bruno, who's a language professor, to say that actually student evaluations shouldn't happen right away, that student evaluation should happen, again, 5 years after you take the class, because we're more concerned with what classes do you even remember, what classes made an impact. And that, of course, puts on the table the fact that professors are influential and professors do have a responsibility regarding the ideas they present for their students. And this notion of how responsible a professor is for their students' actions goes all the way back to classical Greece and Socrates, where he was arrested and put to death for corrupting the youth because many of his students actually committed a coup against Athens. So this question of influence has been powerful and throughout the system. I guess I'll start with Jason, just because Liz was the last person to talk. Do we indoctrinate our students? Is that something that people should legitimately be worried about?
Well, I did write an article a couple years ago on this when I identified myself as an independent conservative, a moniker that I no longer identify with. I went from being a liberal to identifying as a old-fashioned liberal to identifying as a conservative, independent conservative. Now I just think of myself as an independent thinker and a philosopher. I did write an article on that, and thinking about it, looking at the sort of indoctrination that does go on the right. I mean, you look at Hillsdale College, and there is some sort of indoctrination. I would probably revise my position a little bit more. I mean, I do think that philosophy is not really in the business of indoctrinating their students. I mean, I have seen in some of the more activist disciplines some level of indoctrination going on, those disciplines that arose, in the post-Civil War movement that have an activist bent affixed to them. But I think I probably would revise a little bit of the hyperbole that went into an article that I wrote about the indoctrination of our students. I mean, I think there's some in some universities or among certain circles, there is some level of indoctrination. What concerns me more, what I find more chilling, is the evisceration of free speech on campuses that we're seeing now. I mean, we saw some semblance of it with, I think, this notion of defunding syllabi and decolonizing syllabi that was coming from the left, which I had a problem with. And we're seeing something equally pernicious on the right with the cancellation of canonical texts that are coming out of marginalized communities like Black writers like Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, when these figures are being canceled in K through 12 schools. So I think there is a kind of indoctrination that has gone on some level on both sides. Right now, I don't think that we should be that concerned with any kind of indoctrination that's going on in terms of, let me put it this way, a deliberate attempt to infiltrate the minds of students. Because I think in these politically difficult times that we're facing, what we need to do, I think, is what I think philosophy especially needs to do, is to recover a sense of its universal scope and reach and make sure that there is no human being that is evicted from the realm of humanity. And I would like to see those persons who, such as myself, who had sort of accused universities of indoctrinating students, were more concerned with the absence of what I would call intellectual diversity on campuses, right? So I did live through a period where conservative voices were shut down on campuses. People like Condoleezza Rice was not allowed on particular campuses because she was accused of being a war criminal. And that was of great concern to me as a big defender of free speech. And we're seeing the same thing now in the wake of Charlie Kirk's death, where, people who speak out against Kirk or people who speak out against or critical of Israel are being canceled. So I think that's a kind of indoctrination that we're seeing occurring on the other side.
I want to follow up on something you said, Jason, this phrase you used, activist discipline. I think people are going to light on that and wonder what that means. So the first question is what does that mean and what's the context in which you use it? And the follow-up question to that is this still a useful term? Is this a way of thinking about the university that applies in the current context? What is an activist discipline?
Well, I think the activist disciplines are disciplines that arose post-1964 Civil Rights Act, the rise of post-colonial studies, the rise of gender studies, the rise of queer theory, the rise of Black diasporic studies, that had a place for advocacy, that they were legitimate studies that had a role to play in bringing people who were marginalized, people who were, again, excluded from the pantheon of the human community within the domain of the ethical, individuals whose scholarship and whose very identity and agency were neutralized, annihilated, not even considered worthy of metaphysical, moral, epistemological contemplation. And I think there is just an inevitability about the work, the actual work that's being done in such disciplines and a form of activism that had arisen during that time period. Is it still necessary? Well, if you had asked me that question, Jack, 6 years ago, I would have said that an expiration date on the kind of radical activism that was necessary post the 1964 civil rights, that expiration date had occurred. But as I'm watching, and I teach a book called Who is Man by Abram Heschel in every class I teach, regardless of it. As I'm watching, right, I'm paying attention to the language. As I'm watching the demonization of immigrants in this country, and they're being called invaders. As I'm watching I'm rethinking, honestly, I'm a philosopher. I have to sort of revise my positions. I'm rethinking the extent to which the role of those groups, or those disciplines rather, have really expired. I mean, I think continued work probably needs to be done, because what I see happening is the continued evisceration of the dignity of those persons. And maybe it's because I'm doing a lot of work in what I call political friendship. I'm writing a long paper presented at a conference on the role of political friendship and advocacy. It begs the question, who gets to speak for whom? But it's something I'm very interested in as a cosmopolitan in this work of advocacy. So, my mind is open on that issue, and I'm open for radical, not even radical, just even persuasion on that issue, Jack.
We live in an unexpected moment where the statement Nazis are bad is controversial, and where people are legitimately concerned that the Supreme Court might take away women's rights to vote. How do those two things relate, if they relate at all? Do we indoctrinate our students, and what kind of culture of free speech either exists or doesn't exist at your campus?
Right. Well, I want to distinguish two different sources of pressure on students to express or not express their opinions. So one comes from faculty and one comes from students, from their peers. On my committee, it was a university-wide committee composed of faculty, students, and staff from all units across the university, on all campuses as well. And we were asked to evaluate and make recommendations concerning the climate for freedom of expression, for constructive disagreement. Do people feel comfortable expressing their opinion? And we asked for people's stories, like what were their actual personal experiences? Now, keep in mind, in 2024, you had the encampments of people protesting the Gaza war on behalf of Palestinians. So, as you might imagine, when we got stories back, a considerable proportion of them concerned what the climate was like around the encampments or around pro Palestinian protests. But in fact, they ranged much more widely. We got different responses from the medical school, really from all different schools on campus. And my feeling was that, as far as the faculty goes, in places like philosophy or law, which are fundamentally argumentative disciplines, you can't even have a conversation without presenting opposing points of view. Otherwise, there's like nothing to say. I mean, we run on argument. There has to be an opposing side, at least one, usually many. Otherwise, you're just not even teaching philosophy or the law. So those disciplines, I think there's a lot less room for, at least as far as teaching goes, for any kind of indoctrination. It's not to say it never happens, but it doesn't really make sense from a disciplinary point of view. But what we found was that there were certain more activist schools, social work most notably, and to a certain extent, the School of Education, where I think anti-racist education had turned into a kind of catechism. And I want to really underscore agreement with what Jason said about critical race theory. Critical race theory is about systems. It's about institutions. It's about norms. It's not about individuals, really. And it's just a very deep mistake to make individuals feel guilty about being white. It just makes no sense at all when you're looking at systems and practices that people might even be unaware of where they came from and what impact they have on others. It's not really about them as individuals. And what we found in my committee, we got a lot of stories of people who felt hectored and demeaned in the classroom and kind of lectured to in a very heavy handed way, which prevented them from expressing themselves because it wasn't really teaching them anything they didn't know, but they were treated like they were horrible people for being white. At least that's how they felt. I wasn't there. I can't judge that. But that, of course, this is a subjective experience. You have to take that seriously because then, right, that creates a negative climate for students to learn and to speak out and to share their perspectives. And so I think there's an uneven distribution of where problems are arising on campus that we have to be alert to. And some units, I think, really need to recalibrate how they're teaching certain sensitive issues.
This is a really useful reminder that when we talk about university education, we're talking about a huge range of things. Lots of people imagine English classes or philosophy classes, and that's what university education looks like. But there's schools of sociology, schools of education, there's schools of law, there's schools of engineering, there's medical school, there's law school. UND, where I teach, has the huge aviation school, right? There's all of these different units do different things, teach in different ways, and often have different sociological and political assumptions. Liz, continuing with what you just said, how do we balance the perception of students with the desire to figure out what the teacher actually did or intended to do? Because as you rightly point out, this is how the students feel, and we need to respond to how the students feel. But if a student walks away from my lecture on critical race theory and they say, Jack wanted me to feel bad about this, then they're wrong, right? And they misrepresent me. How do we balance the very important response to the perception of students and their subjective experience with the actual process, the actual teaching, the long-term goals of the teacher, who may intentionally be undermining their commitments for pedagogical reasons, to make a philosophical or even political point? How do we balance those two things?
One thing is you have to make space and give students permission to articulate disagreement. And so I do this even in big lecture class, like law and philosophy has about 150 students in it. And, I have regular breaks during that class where I actively invite opposing points of view on hot button issues like affirmative action. And, you have to make room for that. And also to point out that you don't even know your own position if you don't come to terms with objections and oppositional views. And I also make room for that in my paper assignments. So several years ago, in my political philosophy, legal philosophy courses, I teach a lot in political philosophy, and obviously a lot of controversial issues come up there. And I incorporated as part of the assignment that when they take a stand on an issue of some controversy, that's, in political philosophy, that they have to have a conversation with someone who disagrees with them. It could be somebody on campus, but, they could be like their cranky uncle. I don't care who it is, but I want them to discuss in the paper what that conversation was like and give them permission to change their mind and to narrate that. So it's an exercise in open-mindedness. And it's different from the standard philosophy paper where we ask people to take a stand in their opening paragraph and give all the reasons for that position and refute all the objections and then conclude reiterating the stand. Instead, I ask them to more open with a tentative position, engage with others, explore the issue and possible objections, and give them permission at the end to say, I was really confident in this at first, and then I changed my mind, not necessarily just flipping to the opposite point of view, but recognizing that there are some maybe reservations that have to be taken into account, and give them permission to be more tentative and open to further development of their thoughts by the end.
Jason had mentioned in passing John Stuart Mill and his insistence that his work still be taught. And I think it's useful for our listeners to note that Liz, in passing, just asserted one of John Stuart Mill's central principles, which is to know, understand, and believe in something, you have to know why the opposition is false, why you have to understand the opposition and their criticisms. That it's not just believing in what you believe, but it's also understanding, respecting, and evaluating and criticizing the opposition. Jason, I want to ask you a weird question, for a philosopher anyway, before we widen the discussion to philosophy's interaction with the larger non-academic world. And that is, there was a time, in some sense, where political disagreement might have been less intense, where our culture was a little more homogeneous, where there was a sense of the canon as an established, we knew what an educated person was. And philosophy was a place to disagree, the kind of thing that Liz is talking about. But now disagreement is everywhere. Every single thing you post, someone contradicts you. Everything you read, there's the other opinion. We in the United States anyway, we are immersed in a culture of conflict and outrage. Does this lessen the importance of philosophy as a space for disagreement? Is that argumentative, oppositional, even combative vision of philosophy obsolete?
No, not at all. Actually, it increases the chance for philosophy to display, especially in the field of epistemology, the proper role of philosophy in adjudicating properly among disputing truth claims. That is what most people are doing when they are disagreeing, I think, is they are emoting. They are displaying distorted thinking, fallacious arguments, just all sort of rhetorical forms of bad reasoning, clever sophistries. And I think, as someone who's trained in logic, I think it's my job in the classroom to do what a proper philosopher ought to do, which is to provide conceptual instruction, to correct a student when they are engaged in any kind of fallacious form of reasoning that one can spot. No, it places an enormous burden on philosophy to do, among other things, what philosophy does, which is to teach people how to think efficaciously, to correct errors in reasoning, and more importantly, to restore a sense that one's mind, which is basically, I think, one's means of survival, to restore a confidence in the efficacy of one's mind to deal with reality, however one construes reality. And so it doesn't relinquish philosophy's responsibility at all. It increases the burden of philosophy. Part of what saddens me about looking at philosophy over the past 30 years, well, going back to when I was an undergraduate, but really in graduate school, is the way in which philosophy has just allowed what I would call, the competing epistemologies among different disciplines, many of which don't have particular kind of methodology in place. And again, I go back to some of the more radical activist disciplines, which are more concerned with producing particular tangible outcomes and are less concerned with a particular method of cognition. That philosophy, I think, maybe I'm just being elitist and old-fashioned here, but philosophy really ought to be the discipline that provides the particular epistemological standard that other disciplines follow. That is, how do we know what we know? By what means do we know it? What are the meaning tests that we lay down to validate the claims that we have established as propositions that are irrefutable, unassailable, questionable? What's a justified belief? So to answer your question, Jack, no, I think it places even more responsibility on philosophy to establish the procedures, the criteria for proper thinking, efficient thinking, and how to really adjudicate among competing truth claims in a manner that does not fall into what people are doing, which is just emoting.
What you seem to be saying is there's a right and a wrong way to think. There's a good way and a bad way to think. And some people will just say, no, logic and thinking are different things. But is philosophy's role as a standard for thought, philosophers will say normativity, a standard for thought, is that dangerous? Is that manipulative? Does that connect to this concern about indoctrination? How do you respond to the people who say that what philosophy is doing is distinguishing between the people who are thinking goodly and the people who are thinking badly, and that's part of the problem?
Philosophy has capitulated to that kind of malarkey where we have this ideal that's floating around that, reason and logic are the construct of white imperialist European males. And even the attempt to adjudicate among truth claim presupposes that there is a universal and univocal answer to questions of right or wrong. No, I think that philosophy does have the tools to, not with complete infallibility, because we're not infallible, but to give the best possible reasons by providing reasons, evidence, logic, empirical evidence when necessary to adjudicate among the competing truth claims. And to go back to Mill with an open mind that further rejoinders and further contestations are forthcoming and could challenge what one claims to be the truth. With that in question, one doesn't capitulate to the fact that there are a multiplicity of competing truth claims. Therefore, the truth is impossible to arrive at. That just doesn't logically follow. I think the manner, and this is something I try to bring into my classroom, the manner of inclusion, as many people as you can possibly include in a debate, in a dialogical manner of inclusion, that is, people are free to contest, people are free to issue their rejoinders, and people are free to adhere to proper rules of argumentation. So there is something objective, and it's the objectivity that people are fighting against, right? And I think philosophers have to push back on that. There is something objective in the way that logic operates in arguments. And what I would do, what I tend to do very gently in a non-confrontational manner, is to use an example in which objectivity is totally absent and invite people to see that if they carried that inexorably to its logical terminus, how chaos and conflict and complete distortion would be the result in their own stated by the logic of their own stated viewpoint or the position that they hold. So I think one has to exercise also emotional intelligence when using reason and logic, because sometimes the hearer cannot hear the logic of your argument if you're too, confrontational or too. People are emotional creatures, right? But I'm going to insist that philosophy does have a proper procedure of establishing the rules for proper argumentation. Aristotle identified 83 fallacies. I don't know all 83, of course, but I don't think any of us do. But I think that there are criteria for adjudicating among competing truth claims, and they can remain open-ended, right? And they're contestable, and we don't operate as if we're in a hermetically sealed closed system. We invite others always to sort of issue their rejoinders. But, I think, Jack and Liz, that it's this question of objectivity that people push back against.
I'm going to stick with you for a second before I bounce it back to Liz, because one of the transitions I could use, for lack of a better term, is to say, if we're concerned with logic and following the strict patterns of good reasoning, that leads us to computers, that leads us to artificial intelligence. And so if we want emotion-free reasoning, we should rely on artificial intelligence, and large language models in particular have infiltrated the school, our education. We see our students and our colleagues using it both in positive and negative ways, pushing away the question of whether artificial intelligence can think, because that's a whole other conversation and a sort of silly premise. How has artificial intelligence changed the context in which you are teaching and doing philosophy, and has it had not just its own impact in your work and in your teaching, but is it used politically? Is it used to enhance the difficulty of the political environment that we're in right now?
I want to say one thing is that I'm not against emotional free reasoning. I think reason is always mediated by the messiness of life and by our emotions. So, and I think if you look at how judges mete out sentences, they're always going to take the context of, you know, they would look at the past history of a person. They would look at the context of a person before they objectively, so-called, give out a sentence. So I'm not against reasoning be free of emotions at all. I don't know what that would look like. I don't know what a sort of pure reasoning process evacuated of any kind of emotions would look like. I mean, that would be kind of scary to live in that kind of world. I just want to put that on the table.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but our science fiction has tried to articulate that with Mr. Spock and Mr. Data and other characters, and they always go back to the episode or the story where these characters revert back to their emotional selves. You can't tell a human story without communicating emotions, right? I certainly didn't mean to suggest that you think otherwise, but I'm really curious about the role of artificial intelligence and how that affects our context. So I do want to get to Liz's answer like you suggested, but I know that you particularly have been thinking about this and been thinking about what's called transhumanism. Can you spend a second, tell us what transhumanism is, and tell us why this is a particular consideration at this moment in time?
Oxford's Nick Bostrom described transhumanism as, he says, it's the rejection of the traditional idea that the human condition is static, and that science and technology, he says, can be embraced to welcome a dazzling landscape of radical possibilities, ranging from unlimited bliss to the extinction of intelligent life. And so it's the idea that human nature is neither fixed nor worth preserving, that human beings are just so malleable that we can sort of radically change and twist it. But what is not stated is twist it to fit the perverted ends of certain algorithms that are devoted to the profit motives of these technocrats. And so in the classroom, I see my students outsourcing their moral agency. I see them outsourcing their intellectual capabilities, their capacity to think critically to these AI bots, to ChatGPT, among other bots. And so I think that even when I ask a question related to John Stuart Mill, this is why I have a technology-free classroom, no cell phones, no computers, no tablets. They have to print out the material and bring it to the classroom because I'm asking a question on John Stuart Mill and they're texting it into the ChatGPT box and giving me the answer. So they've completely outsourced everything. And so I think even the way that their political imagination, their moral imagination would be activated or exercised is being hijacked by AI in the classroom.
And I want to ask Liz specifically your reaction to the phrasing that Jason just used, which I really like, outsourcing their moral agency, outsourcing their intellectual agency. Is this something that you're seeing with your students as well?
I think my students are aware of the dangers of doing this. And they actually, one of the things I do in my classes is have my undergraduates discuss in the first meeting, the first discussion section meeting, what they think are the pluses and minuses of using large language models for their work. And they actually are pretty reflective about it. They're worried about losing their own agency. And then because I teach political philosophy, I say, okay, well, we could run a little social contract here. Why don't you have a discussion and make a social contract among yourselves about what are good and bad uses of Chat GPT or what have you in your paper writing and other assignments? And they're pretty reasonable. I share Jason's skepticism about what the tech bros, how they want us to be using this. I don't think that they have very good views about our future. And for them, it's mostly about making money. But the students are actually quite thoughtful. And, I don't have a problem if they want to clean up their grammar and get the assistance of an AI to do that. And they pretty much are aware that developing their own personal voice is a very, very important thing for them to learn through their writing that requires some struggle. And they've come up with some pretty reasonable constraints on how to use that. Now, of course, you can't always know when they're using it or when not. One of my colleagues has decided to go to pure oral exams for the final exam because then they really like they have nothing but their own brains to work on. So we're still working this out, but some modest uses of AI, I think it can be of assistance, especially for people who don't speak English as their first language, just to help them with grammar.
Very often the picture of student-teacher interactions that we get is a picture of power where students are passive and easily manipulable and professors are all powerful and Svengali-like. In your experience, how capable are the students of advocating for themselves, asserting their own intellectual and moral agency? How much is the student moral and political voice present in the class, separate from the structures that you set up, but just as people, as humans, as citizens? How capable are college students of asserting themselves into the environment and in the conversation?
I want to get back to a point I made, the distinction between what's coming from the professors and what's coming from their peers. I suppose there are some students who are afraid of how they might be graded in a classroom if they disagree with the professor. I try to run things pretty clean. You have the pros and you have the cons,
Right.
and you have to show both and give some balance to that for any position that's being discussed. But they try to guess my opinion, but I tell them, look, there's nothing more boring and dispiriting than reading a paper where you see that what the student's trying to do is pander to what they think your opinion is. It's
Yeah.
just boring.
Yeah.
It's just like, who wants to read that? I want to read what they think. That's interesting. Just seeing a pale, distorted reflection of what they think I think is like unbelievably boring. But I do think that the students feel enormous pressure from their peers not to say anything that would make them, right, canceled or what have you. And so I work a lot in the classroom to encourage students and say, look, the other thing that's really important that gets to the question of emotions, I actually think emotions can often open us up to be attuned to other human beings and to pick up on cues that maybe we can't fully articulate yet that are nevertheless morally very, very powerful and important. Sometimes our emotions are smarter than the official beliefs we consciously hold in our heads, and they can cue us that maybe there's something wrong with our beliefs. But what I do worry about is people fearing that they will be like ejected, ostracized, or what have you, from the community if they express a certain point of view. People need permission and freedom and a safe space to say stuff that other people will object to. And for me, the key emotion is connected that is really obstructing discussion is the worry that they would be a bad person and other people would think that they're a bad person for expressing some viewpoint. And then they attach themselves too much, they identify too much with taking certain positions which they think define them as good people. And what I want people to do is not so much identify their goodness or value with what they believe. People believe all kinds of things at different moments. They believe different things, and people can learn and change and grow. In order to do that, they need permission to say things that maybe other people take offense at. I want them to be sincere. I want them to be open. I want them to respect every other person's humanity in the classroom and to respect the fact that everyone's there as a community member participating, but then open themselves up to the risks of exploration and of growth that comes from people pushing back on you. But it doesn't make you a bad person because you said something that other people take offense at. It means that you weren't fully aware of, everybody out there and the fact that there are other views and other people who need to be taken into account and other facts in the world that maybe you weren't aware of.
there's interesting sociological research that shows that more exposure to professors actually moderates student opinion, and it's their peers that radicalizes them. And I think that that is representative of what you're talking about. Actually, that philosophy of law class that I mentioned earlier, just last week, we were talking about disagreement in the classroom, and I literally said to them, I'm a Jew who grew up in New York, and I've spent the last 25 years in North Dakota. Do you think I haven't encountered people who disagree with me? Right? They worry about that and the language of siloing and all that kind of stuff. The question that I've been building up to, and that is a really serious question that we haven't given any attention to, I'm going to address to Liz first, because you've done 2 books on workers' rights and worker representation and exploitation of the labor force. If I were a professor in 1965 and I looked back and my teaching stance was, I'm not going to take a position on civil rights because I'm a teacher. Here's both sides. I don't think I could look at myself in the mirror. I think there are certain truths that need to be advocated for because I'm a human being, because I'm a citizen, and philosophy is subordinate to that, not superior to that. What role does philosophy have as a discipline, including in the classroom? What role does it play in advocating for justice, in recognizing the evils of the world that need to be repaired? You know, the idea of individual rights, the idea of the freedom of women, of slaves, of cosmopolitanism, as Jason talks about in his work, that we're all one humanity. That a lot of that comes from the history of philosophy that has often been the vanguard of some of these questions of justice and morality and individual rights. Liz, what's the responsibility of philosophers at this moment to advocate for people in positions who might either not be able to advocate for themselves or simply to supplement what they're saying and doing?
In my classroom, I don't really see it as a space for advocacy. Now, there are some presuppositions of the classroom and of the learning community, which are not open to debate. Okay, everyone in the classroom, everyone at the university, all the students, they're members of a learning community. And we won't even put up for discussion whether somebody shouldn't be there. They are there and they're welcome. Everyone is welcome and everyone has to be treated as a human being. And you won't even allow it to be put up for debate. It isn't. This is a constitutive feature of a learning community. But I don't believe in preaching in the classroom. But sometimes what I'll do is bring for consideration certain historical realities, things that have happened, things that still exist in the world, certain causal mechanisms and so forth, which will cast doubt, on certain racist ideas, sexist ideas and so forth. It's important to not preach as if you already have all the conclusions at hand, but rather to expose students who might be tempted by certain views to facts and realities that would cast doubt on those views. And I see that part of my duty as a teacher.
Are the standards you use in the classroom different than the standards you use in your research and your publications and your books? Do you feel and have a wider level of moral certainty and advocacy in the research that you do as opposed to...
Yeah. I mean, look, in my research, right, that's a different story. Like, I'm taking positions. I'm explaining where I stand. But in the classroom, right, philosophy is dead if it's not engaging with different perspectives and different points of view. It has to do that. And in my writing, too, especially when in my writing in the history of philosophy, which my last 2 books about work really concern, there's a lot of work that I do on historical figures like Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and John Locke. And indeed, Hijacked, which is the history of the work ethic, I go back to the Calvinist theologians who invented it and read their texts, which are, by the way, quite wonderful, even though I find their theology appalling. They're really serious moralists, and I take them really serious. They're very worth engaging.
I'm going to throw that question to Jason, too. We're running long, but I think this is super important. And you don't have to truncate your answer. Jason, what's the role of philosophy in the political discourse when you are thinking about research? And how much do you feel a responsibility to speak towards your moral, political, social beliefs when you publish to the larger world?
I'm a moralist by temperament, and I'm a moral philosopher and political theorist by training. So there is an inseparability between my personal identity and my moral identity. They're not separable. And I decided to become a writer at 10 and announced to my mother I wanted to become a philosopher when I was 15. It was it's a vocational calling for me. It's as important as drinking water. So, my very first book, written 25 years ago out of graduate school, Becoming a Cosmopolitan, What It Means to Be a Human Being in the New Millennium, which was love of humanity. What would it mean to strip ourselves of our ethnic, racial, national identities and realize the responsibilities that we have to each other as citizens of the world? That's the driving force behind everything that I do in my role as a philosopher. And I agree with Liz. I don't proselytize in the classroom. I don't preach. But my sensibilities are so saturated with my cosmopolitan ethos that I find that it affects how I approach philosophy in the classroom, in the sense that, again, I go back, I'm a bit of an old-fashioned teacher in the sense that I take it as my job to be a participant in the continued socialization of my students. That is, their sensibilities and their moral imagination are mine, among other things, to continue shaping and formulating. And so the big question that looms large, I think, in all of my class is, what does it mean to be a human being? What are the constitutive features that suffuse our humanity? What does that look like? And in a world in which human dignity is being eviscerated on a daily basis, in a world in which more and more, as borders become more porous, we find something concomitantly happening. More and more people are being evicted from the pantheon of the human community. More and more groups of people are being demonized and dehumanized. My job as a philosopher is to be the custodian of those individuals, to make sure that their humanity is safeguarded and protected. And so in the classroom, unconsciously, my sensibilities are so covered with that ethos of love of humanity, protecting the dignity of all persons. And I take it consciously as my job. And this is very old-fashioned. My colleagues think that I'm some sort of 19th century relic. But I do take it as my job to be participating in the continued socialization of the students, of refining their sensibilities. I mean, I write in my merit evaluation that part of my job is to establish a sort of nobility and excellence. I get laughed at. Establish sort of nobility of character and excellence in the souls of my students by first embodying it in myself and manifesting it in the classroom. Not just a nobility, but also a sense of grandeur. And these are all very, very old-fashioned notions that I think the university might have given up on, and I don't know if philosophy has given up on it. And then the whole notion of political friendship informs my work to some degree. That's a question I ask myself all the time. It began with my work in cosmopolitanism. What does political friendship look like in terms of advocacy? Linda Alcoff wrote a very, very interesting paper in epistemology, Who Gets to Speak for Whom? And, those of us who do have some semblance of power in terms of literary currency or the capacity to speak must ask ourselves that question. How do we speak on behalf of those who are marginalized, those who have no political voice, without mistranslating their stories, without suppressing their voices? I had sort of stopped that work when I got into being a public intellectual and flirted a little bit with conservatism. And now I'm sort of going back to my roots of being an old-fashioned cosmopolitanism and taking up this work of political friendship and advocacy very, very seriously, because I think Liz is right. I mean, the emotional part of my identity as a philosopher is superseding in many respects, not the logical component of my identity as a philosopher, but they're coming back to a healthy meeting place. This love of humanity, this notion of world citizenship, conjoined with objective scholarship and research. It's all coming back together. I'm going back to my roots where I started out 25 years ago, 28 years ago, and seeing some very beautiful results.
This is an excellent segue to my final question, which I'll start with you, Jason, and then ask Liz to respond, which I'm going to phrase as a closing statement. The three of us are senior scholars. We've written a lot of books between us. Our listeners don't know this, but Liz is a teacher at one of the most important and influential PhD programs, philosophy PhD programs in the world. Very, very highly regarded and influential arena. I want to ask both of you to talk directly to the philosophers who are listening. And I want to ask you, and maybe this is a little unfair, but I want to ask if you can, what would you tell your colleagues about how to be a philosopher now? The professoriate is afraid. The professoriate is vulnerable. There's a lot going on, and a lot of people feel like their lives are very precarious. And yet we all have this existential commitment to philosophy and being philosophers. Jason, first you and then Liz. Talk directly to the philosophers of the world. How do we do philosophy in these politically difficult times?
That's a rather awkward position you put me in, Jackie.
It's what they pay me for.
It's very daunting to speak to philosophers. First of all, it's even more daunting to tell them how to do philosophy. So anything I say must be sort of rather conjectural and in a spirit of suggesting. But the one thing that has always bothered me about philosophy when I started out as a young graduate student was its narrowness. Right? There's a sort of parochialism within the field of philosophy. I remember going to my teacher in Kant and asking him a question about Kant's moral philosophy. And he says, no, I do nothing but the third antinomy. That's all I've been doing all my life. And that's all I'll do for the rest of my life. And I thought, oh my God, what a dreadful experience. So there's a sort of, and philosophy has not grown as far as I can tell. Individual philosophers have done very interesting things. We've seen work on AI. We've seen work in feminist philosophy, in all individual works. But one thing I would say is that philosophers are the most conservative among the professoriate in the humanities. They're the least likely to change and to evolve, I must say. And so I would really encourage my colleagues to broaden their perspectives, to get outside. I know analytic philosophers who are doing the same questions on locution and perlocution in philosophy of language that they were doing 30 years ago. They have not evolved. Is to get outside the narrow confines of their discipline and to look at the world and try to incorporate some aspect of humanity at large in their world, just to try to evolve a little bit. And I mean this quite seriously. And it's not because I do everything from foreign policy to I'm writing a book on Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton and suicide and poetry and politics and so on. But I think there's a real necessity, given against the backdrop of what Heschel said, that, philosophy can't be the same after Auschwitz. I think in these times, philosophy just cannot remain as highly specialized and narrow. And I'll take John Rawls as an example, a philosopher I adore. But you read a theory of justice, which is ideal theory, and there's no mention of racism. There's no mention of the riots. There's no mention of anything in the real world. It's just like this closed system that ignores the reality of the messiness of the real world. And I think philosophers really have to sort of really open themselves up, the field itself, not individual philosophers, but how philosophy conceives of itself has to really change in relationship to the work that it takes itself to be doing. That's a very, very hefty undertaking and a daunting task for philosophy.
I appreciate that very much. Liz, what do you say to your colleagues who are listening in terms of how to do philosophy in these politically difficult times?
My whole career has been a campaign in a way to get philosophers to do more a non-ideal theory. Now, my dissertation advisor was John Rawls, and I learned an enormous amount from him. But I think he was writing at the time of peak liberalism, where he could be confident that certain principles had been established and agreed to, certain principles of justice, and it was only take a few more nudges to get people to accept even more detailed prescriptions. And now, of course, all of that has been thrown into doubt because of political changes. And in non ideal theory, you start with people's problematic experiences and you work out from there. What are the problems that we're contending with? Well, there's no shortage of problems out there in the world. And that forces philosophers to engage more with empirical realities and with the social sciences. So, a big part of what I do actually is the philosophy of the social sciences, investigating the potential of different modes of social scientific inquiry to shed light on our current predicaments. To my great pleasure, the discipline has been moving in those directions. So I founded and designed the philosophy, politics, and economics major, which is run by the philosophy department here at University of Michigan. And these programs are proliferating. They're virtually all run by philosophy departments. But of course, people who do that kind of work have to be engaging with economics and political science and indeed a lot of other social sciences to really run these programs well. And so I think actually the discipline is moving. And another thing that is moving and enriching the discipline of philosophy, frankly, is that although we were well behind the other humanities and social sciences, now we have much more demographic diversity than in the past. And partly that's just a product of the pipeline, the fact that our undergraduate student bodies and hence our graduate student bodies are getting more diverse in their nationality, their race, and so forth. And that's a big plus because people bring with them their own experiences. And I think there's less confidence than philosophers used to have in the idea that we are even capable of speaking from the view from nowhere. And a lot of what we need to do is to recognize the parochiality of their perspectives, even when we pretend to speak or think we're speaking from the view from nowhere. There's always an element there that really isn't perfectly universal, but is expressing, who we are. And to make that conscious and explicit, I think actually ends up enriching the possibilities for philosophy because it opens us up to why people are thinking differently, since they're coming from a different set of experiences and concerns. And then we come to see philosophy as a constant effort to merge our horizons rather than each of us imagining that we have the final answer.
If nothing else, the two of you have convinced me that I need to do an episode on ideal versus non-ideal theory, and I think that that's a tremendously important issue that has escaped Y Radio. This is a complicated and difficult discussion, and as we've seen, it's tremendously widely ranging. Jason, Liz, thank you so much for joining us on Y.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. It's been wonderful to talk to you.
You've been listening to Elizabeth Anderson, Jason D. Hill, and myself, Jack Russell Weinstein, on Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. I'll be back with a few more thoughts right after this.
Visit IPPL's blog, PQED, Philosophical Questions Every Day, for more philosophical discussions of everyday life. Comment on the entries and share your points of view with an ever-growing community of professional and amateur philosophers. You can access the blog and view more information on our schedule, our broadcasts, and the Y Radio store at www.philosophyandpubliclife.org.
You're back with Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. I'm your host, Jack Russell Weinstein. We were talking with Elizabeth Anderson and Jason D. Hill about how to do philosophy in politically difficult times. And this is a weird segue, but I often tell my students that how you break up with someone does more to define the relationship than how you're together with them. That you will live with breaking up badly and treating your partner poorly more than you'll live with the successes, the happiness, the love. It becomes part of you, but it fades in the background. The breaking up is what haunts you. And this is what I had in mind as I thought about Jason and Liz's comments to philosophers, Jason and Liz's comments about philosophy. We can't control other people. We can't control what's going to happen. We are in unpredictable times and no one knows what's going to happen. And so the question that you are going to ask yourself in the future is, how did you behave yourself now? How will you live with yourself in terms of the person and the philosopher you were when things became difficult? That requires self-understanding and reflection, and not everyone is going to do it the same way. Some people want to be in the ivory tower, quietly working on their own corner of the world, and some people want to be out advocating for whoever and whatever in the loudest of voices. You should do philosophy the way that you see philosophy. You should do you the way that you do you. One of the things that really dominated the conversation was that when we talk about philosophers, we are also talking about philosophy professors. There are very, very few philosophers in this world who are not also philosophy professors, who are not also in the classroom. And how we do philosophy in the classroom is just as important as how we do our research. And that too necessitates self-reflection. And that too necessitates your own sense of what a moral and responsible pedagogue can do and what our duty of care is. And that makes things more complicated as well. Do philosophy as you see fit. Do philosophy in a way that you will be proud of in 5, 10, 20 years. And don't change who you are, even though circumstances are asking you to do that. With all of that said, if you've been listening to this episode on Sunday evening on Prairie Public, please know that a longer version with a lot more discussion is available online and as a podcast. Visit whyradioshow.org to listen or subscribe for free. That's whyradioshow.org. For everyone else, rate us on iTunes and Spotify to help spread the word about the show. Follow us on all the usual social networks. Our handle is always @whyradioshow. And please help us continue broadcasting by making your tax-deductible donation at whyradioshow.org. Click Donate in the upper right-hand corner to go to UND Alumni's donation portal. We exist solely on the money you provide. Thank you yet again to Liz and Jason, to the folks at Prairie Public, especially our engineer, Tay Calloway. I'm Jack Russell Weinstein signing off for Why Radio. Thanks for listening. And as always, it's an honor to be with you.
Why is funded by the Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, Prairie Public Broadcasting, and the University of North Dakota's College of Arts and Sciences and Division of Research and Economic Development. The music is written and performed by Mark Weinstein and can be found on his album Louis E. Soul. For more of his music, visit jazzfluteweinstein.com or myspace.com/Mark Weinstein. Philosophy is everywhere you make it, and we hope we've inspired you with our discussion today. Remember, as we say at the Institute, there is no ivory tower.